Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to the All Saints podcast. I'm here with my wife and best friend, Nicole, Jeffery. This is the first time we've done a podcast like this together.
Yeah, it is.
And the reason we've done it is because I received a number of requests and questions from ladies at the church here over the last few months, including a couple recently, which circled around the theme of emotional resilience and emotional stability and handling our emotions. And a number of these were from ladies in the church. This is a subject that Nicole has taught on for the ladies at All Saints here. Yeah. And so I just wanted to bring her in and stick her under the cameras and see what happened. I mean, truth is, not joking too much, I think Nicole has developed some significant emotional resilience over the time she's been married to me. Some people might say you've had to. I don't know whether that's fair, but I wonder if we could start just. Most people at All Saints know you a little bit, Nicole, and some people know you well. But just give us a quick sketch of childhood very briefly, and then early adult life, just to give us a feel for who you are and where you come from and so on.
Okay, so born in England, obviously, though my mother's not English, middle of three daughters, moved house twice while I was growing up to quite different parts of the country, so two big fresh starts, then spent a year working before going to college, which is where I met Steve, and then we got married the year after that. I worked for a number of years, and then when we moved to seminary, I had 3 children, and then Steve became a pastor, and the rest is history.
The rest, as I say, is history. I want to zoom in on a couple of your more recent phases of your life since we've been married, in part because I think you've grown as a woman through those experiences, thinking, I'll come to the children in a few minutes, but you worked for a number of years for an oil company. Tell us about that and about the environment there and what it was like working there. You enjoyed it or you didn't enjoy it? What was it like?
Yeah, so I worked for BP, and I should say I left before the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah,
that was nothing to do with me. But yeah, so I trained as a chemical engineer, and I joined BP and worked in various parts of the company and really, really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the work environment, enjoyed the people, enjoyed the work, travelled quite extensively, sometimes perhaps too much, and generally I really enjoyed being there and that type of work.
Right. So let's just jump into this subject, emotional resilience. We've talked about this on and off over the years a fair amount. We have also talked about it in preparation for this conversation. And at one point, I think you asked me something like, so what do you mean by emotional resilience? And I think my way of framing it was something like, it's the capacity to remain emotionally stable or properly emotionally oriented to our circumstances, in spite of external shocks, external pressures, or even sometimes internal pressures. And it's interesting. I think this is something we've both grown in. We were talking just this morning about when our youngest was born and the difference between her, the effect of that shock of child number 3 coming along compared to child number 1. Why don't you tell that story, because I think there's quite a lot to learn from that.
Yeah, so when we had our first child, Ben, I found it completely overwhelming. Didn't have a single free minute in the day. Just life seemed unbelievably busy. Shortly after we had our third child, the 2 older children, Ben and Becky, went to stay with my parents for a couple of days. And so I just had baby Abby, and I felt like there was nothing to do. And I don't think that was because she was a very easy baby compared to Ben. I think it was rather that we had grown in our ability to kind of cope with a new baby and all the things that entailed.
So the thing that strikes me about that, I mean, just looking back at it, I remember it very clearly as well. And I remember going for a walk with Abby and literally saying something like, well, this is easy. And of course, the reason it was easy was because Dick and Ava, your parents had got Ben and Becky, but when Ben was born, it really was kind of stressful and such a new experience.
Yeah.
And there's just something really obvious going on here, whereby we grow in response to difficult, painful, or just new experiences. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You and I, again, we talk, and the kids mock me for the references I make around the family breakfast table to Nassim Taleb's book Anti-Fragile.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, maybe we don't need to recount the mockery, but anti-fragility is a really intriguing idea. And if I just summarize how Nassim Taleb, who's not writing as a Christian, he described himself as a Lebanese Christian, but he's not writing from a Christian perspective particularly. But if I describe it, and then maybe you want to share how you think that sort of transposes onto your experience as a wife and a mother. So, fragile, robust, anti-fragile represent three different ways in which things respond to external shocks. So, something that's fragile, like a teacup, you drop it on the floor, it just shatters into 1,000 pieces. Something that's robust, be like a tennis ball. You drop it on the floor, and it's not affected negatively or positively. It just bounces. I mean, you bounce it 100,000 times, it's just going to keep bouncing, keep bouncing. So fragile, it breaks. Robust, nothing happens. Anti-fragile is more like a human muscle. You know, it's like doing, instead of dropping something on the floor, you go for a run or you do 100 press-ups or something of that kind. What happens is that the response to the external stress makes the thing stronger. And it struck me that when we talk about emotional resilience for people, you can't really have that without anti-fragility. I mean, that was your insight. We talked about it this morning.
Yeah.
So talk about that. How's that shown itself in your life as a mum and as a wife, and how would you connect these ideas of resilience and anti-fragility? Maybe pick one of those and just run with it.
If I start with the second of those two thoughts, I think if you're resilient in situations, you do just become anti-fragile. That is, you become stronger. I think if something happens, you either get knocked to one side by it negatively, or you actually are not the other way, and it grows your capacities, it grows you as a person. You're more able to cope with that kind of shock, that kind of knock, or that kind of challenge at a future event. So, I mean, one example of where this has played out, I think, in our family life is in hospitality. So thinking about, and there are quite a few funny stories, but there were not a few times, there were quite a lot of times where we would be homeschooling, and I would get a call maybe about half an hour, 20 minutes before lunch, and Steve would just say, oh, I've met somebody and we got talking, can he come back and have lunch with us? And I can't remember the first time it happened or how I felt about it, but it became not infrequent, maybe every couple of months or so that would happen. And so that just became very normal, having extra people round at lunchtimes. And actually, I think it was great for our kids because they suddenly all these people would turn up for lunch, and it would be an interesting lunchtime one way or another. And that kind of, once you've done it a couple of times, it becomes normal, and you just find a way to stretch the meal, and it's not a problem at all.
Yeah. So what's interesting about that, and we should explain, by the way, this is in the context in North London where we used to live, where the church that I used to pastor was located. Our main mission field was within a couple of miles of our front door. It was basically, we lived 10 minutes walk from the church. We're in this little area of London called Southgate, which is like it's probably 50 or 100,000 people. Suburbia, there's a tube station, there's a bunch of shops, and I would go and spend time there either actively doing evangelism, or I would think of it as passively doing evangelism, sitting in a coffee shop doing sermon prep with my Bible in front of me and just praying that somebody would come and talk to me. And so in that context, when things went well, I'd get into a conversation with somebody, and especially if I was in a kind of active evangelistic kind of mode, the kind of people you're talking to outside the tube station in the middle of the afternoon are people who have time on their hands because they have some kind of social challenge. Maybe they're unemployed or something. Often there's some issue. And so you bring people back, and it strikes me that I can still remember one of the early times when I called you. I was walking down the road with, I forget who it was. It didn't matter who it was, but there was this kind of silence on the end of the line for a moment. I said, I've got somebody, I'm coming back for lunch. Is it okay if I bring somebody else? And your response seemed to be the response of somebody who was thinking, well, I can't really say no, can I? Like what?
Absolutely.
And so now within that context, there's actually a lesson there. Now, and this wasn't my intention, okay? I promise, my darling, I was not trying to put you in a situation where you were forced to toughen up emotionally. That was not at all. But it's interesting, I think, that being forced to embrace that kind of challenge, like having no option, sometimes brings the best out of us. No, you didn't have no option. If you'd said, honestly, darling, 2 of the kids are just thrown up, the third one is looking queasy, I think
go to a coffee shop.
Go to a coffee shop and have lunch, that would have been fine. But the sense of having to rise to the occasion, maybe that's what I'm getting at. If we have to rise to the occasion, it does bring the best out of us. Is that something you've seen yourself and you think is a lesson that other people could learn?
Oh yeah, I think you see that in many different aspects of life. So in hospitality more broadly, the first time you have someone around for a meal, it can be quite daunting. When you've done it, 50, 100 times, it's not so stressful. Or numbers of people coming round, the more you do these things, the easier they get. But it's not just in that, also many other areas, like in homeschooling. When I first started out homeschooling, I thought, gosh, this whole project is kind of mine. This is such a huge responsibility to educate my children. But as time went on and sort of planning things, using resources that were available to me, talking to people where possible, looking for role models, and gradually, I found it was much more doable than I thought it was, or thought it would be.
Right. And it strikes me as well then that if we look at how our culture has shifted, I mean, your parents were raised in 2 very different worlds than the world that we're now living in, or the world in which we were raised. And obviously, we've talked to them a fair bit about that. Your father was raised during the war and then post-war Britain, your mum in post-war Vienna. Those were contexts in which there were plenty of opportunities to develop your anti-fragile muscles, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Your dad's mum and dad, for that matter, were extremely resourceful and hardworking people, and your dad has grown into he's the kind of guy who can be almost crippled with arthritic pain in his fingers and knees and hips before he even mentions it. And in our culture, we're deprived of those opportunities, which is to say, in our culture, we are blessed with a measure of comfort that our parents and grandparents really wanted for us. And all of us are in this sort of position to different degrees. It's possible for us to go days and weeks and months and years without that painful necessity of really being stretched. And so we don't get that opportunity. And then, of course, something does happen, perhaps a childhood illness from one of our kids, or unemployment, or some other issue arises, and we're thrown for a loop potentially before we finally kick into gear and grow. And I wonder if, whether you have any reflections on the culture that we're living in, how that has affected us negatively, and I don't want to say made it too easy for us, but we should take account of that in our culture as we're thinking about our lives.
Yeah, so I was actually thinking a little bit along those lines earlier today with things like just the appliances we have, so dishwashers, washing machines, tumble dryers. We're so used to having these things. We become so dependent on them, and when they break or go wrong, it feels like a huge crisis. And yet, none of our grandmothers had these things, I suspect, unless you're very young. But we just become very dependent on them, and then we feel like it's kind of a crisis when they're not working. And yet when you look at women who, Christian women who you really look up to, the things that they have worked through and faced that are a lot more significant than the dishwasher not working, and they've done it with joy and cheerfulness. And yeah.
Because that leads on to an issue that I really wanted to ask you about. Nicole's reading a book at the moment, okay, it was called A Marriage to a Difficult Man.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, thanks. And it's not an autobiography.
It's not an autobiography.
It's not her autobiography. It's well, tell us about it. Who's it about, and why is it called what it is, and why do you keep reading these biographies of Christian women who had difficult lives? What's going on?
Okay, so it's a biography of Sarah Edwards, so the wife of Jonathan Edwards. And it's called that because in many ways he was a difficult man to be married to. He was a brilliant man by all accounts. I mean, a theologian, right up there. But he wasn't an easy man to live with, and they had many problems. They had 11 children, and that obviously has problems of its own. But there were just many, many things which she had to deal with. So, if she wanted clothes for her children, well, she started with the sheep, and then, then she got the wool, and then so on and so forth before she actually got to the clothing for her children. She didn't just, pop down to, Walmart and see what's on offer. And the same with everything else, with food and with 1,000 other things that we can do so much more easily than people could do in her era. But she was unbelievably competent. She juggled so many things in order that her husband wouldn't have to deal with them, so that he could get on with the jobs or the tasks that lay before him, particularly for him in the areas of theology, which I think is it's interesting to see how her helper, being his helper, had that particular shape, and she did many, many things in their household, which I suspect, and I reading between the lines of the text, many other wives in that particular context weren't doing, but she was doing them so that she could be a suitable helper for her husband. And he was quite a difficult guy to be with, sort of emotionally and socially, I think.
Right. So it's interesting, there's an implicit biblical theology of marriage there, as well as a kind of personal piety. And the personal piety is obvious in a sense. It's somebody who is hardworking, dedicated, resourceful, under the pressure of circumstances, doing the best she can to provide for her kids and for her husband. But the theology of being the helper here, it starts to speak directly to married women and the issue of resilience. And I guess what I have in mind, if I frame it like this, most husbands have jobs which at times place demands on them that are above and beyond the ideal at that moment. It would be nice if hubby was home at 5:30 and it's 7 o'clock still and he's just not back, or it's 8 o'clock, and occasionally I get calls from you because I've made a couple of calls after work here, and it's like, are you coming home? It's like, yeah, I'm on I-35 now. So many, many men, in fact, probably most, if not all men at times, have callings which demand from them more than they wish they did, and more than their wives and children wish they did. So here's the problem at that point. We can easily find ourselves in a competition for Dad's attention, or a competition for my husband's attention. And it's like, what? Your children need you, I need you, and your work is taking you away. And there's enough in that that's true to make it credible, because it is true that a minute spent at work is not a minute spent with your 2-year-old reading bedtime stories, or a minute with your wife having a glass of wine in the evening, or just chatting with her. But there's a danger of this ethos of competition for your husband's time, and the image of the helper, I think, really cuts into that from an unexpected angle and in a really powerful way. Did you want to speak about how does it, so to speak, help you to think of yourself self-consciously as the helper of your husband?
I think I think it's been different at different times in our marriage and different stages of family life. So when we had children, that ultimate responsibility of raising the children does sit with the father, and yet you delegated a huge swathe of that to me. And part of that, I think, I saw as helping you to free up your time to do the other things, the other vocations that you had, the other demands on your time. And also then when you have come in the evening and you've been more tired than I'd hoped, or it's been later than I'd hoped, or you've been more distracted than I'd hoped, to think, well, I am here to be helping you in the vocation that you have. I'm not just here to be taking from you the minute that you come from the door. Come through the door.
Mm-hmm. Well, so it's interesting then at that point, I want to take a sideways step and so in a sense acknowledge that, so you have a husband who is a pastor. It's easy, it's easier for you to see that as a vocation.
True, yeah.
So, but then I want to say, well, hold on a second. The Protestant reformers didn't just teach us about a liturgical renewal and justification by faith alone. They also taught us that all of our lawful vocations are worthy and a blessing and honourable in God's sight. So if your husband is an insurance salesman or a businessman or an actuary or a rancher or a school teacher or whatever else he is, that's a gift from God to him and therefore from him to the world, in which you're his partner as a wife. So all the things that we want to say to, in this situation, men who are out in the workplace and wives who are at home, especially with children, all the things you want to say to the guys, you want to say to the wives as well in their roles as a partner with their husbands. And it's almost like a mental and emotional reframing, isn't it? Like trying to think of it, I'm not competing for my husband's time. My husband wants to give me his time. He loves me. I do. I promise. You looked at me like that. And my husband wants to give me his time. He loves me. I trust him. And at times his work is going to be high pressure and he's going to be weeks away or long nights when he's not back until late. And I'm his partner in this. I wonder as well whether that gives us an impetus to consider the preciousness of the time we have together, as well as the kind of partnership thing for our wives.
Yeah, I think one thing we've tried to do over the years, and this is maybe coming a little bit off the topic of resilience, but is to try and have at least once a week some special time, just the two of us without the children or without other people in the evening. And I actually think that's been really beneficial, even when we've been very tired and even when we haven't sat down till nearly 9 o'clock. It quite often has been in the past. But still we've sat down and we've had a meal, the two of us, even though we've been tired. And I think that's been a real blessing for us over the years.
Well, I think you say it is related to the topic. Sorry, you carry on.
I was going to say, and I think that builds a strength in the marriage, which makes the marriage more resilient.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
So
we're
that
thinking
was
the
just
same thing.
go,
No, it is a distinct topic. I mean, so if you were talking to somebody about the subject of growing in mental and emotional capacity, it wouldn't naturally occur to you to say, well, when do you sit down with your wife or with your husband and just have time together? And for us, it really was. There were times, and to my shame, there were times where we wouldn't sit down until 9 o'clock, or once or twice it was 9:10, and then by 10 o'clock I've literally fallen asleep on the couch. We'd have a meal, I remember, and it went for there was a period of a few months where it almost became a joke.
Yeah.
Like we'd finally get in. Nicole was out with the kids, and I'd been working, and then back and forth, and finally everything's cleared up. It's about 9:05. We sit down and eat something. 9:30. The only thing I can think I've got the energy to do is to sit down and watch a DVD of something. And within 20 minutes I've fallen asleep. And poor Nicole is sitting on the sofa with me slumped like this. So it's not always been that the caricatured, picture perfect, everything's going perfectly well. But I think you are right that it was one of the best pieces of advice I ever got from my old mentor and our old friend Richard Cokin. Like you can't just survive on Friday night and Saturdays together. You do need to carve out another evening in the week. And for us, Friday night, we were with the kids a lot as well. But another evening in the week where the kids know, that's right, the kids know this is time for you to be together. And I think there have been times when we've not done it, but it's been either one of us has been physically away or we've just moved it to another night of the week.
Yeah.
It's probably been the most fixed element in our
apart from church.
calendar. apart from church.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
You said a couple of things a few minutes ago. You're talking about homeschooling, the feeling of being overwhelmed, even with kids, the feeling of being overwhelmed. Do you want to talk about some of the practical things that you've done to deal with that? And I'll preface it in this way. So that there's a temptation to say, oh, she's just really organised, or she's just really competent, or she just can cope with doing lots of things at once. And the truth is, people are different. People have different emotional capacities and so on. But all these things can be learned as well. And we can develop structures to help us. So I think you are very, very organised. And I also think you're very competent and you're good at the things you do. But it's not just like you roll out of bed in the morning and just drift through them. Do you want to talk about some of the things you've done with the kids, with schooling stuff, and just with household management, which have actually increased your resilience in the sense they've given you a capacity to handle just the normal practicalities of busy mum, busy wife?
Yeah, I think it's almost a bit of a joke that I'm quite a planner, but I think
you reckon?
But I think that has borne tremendous fruit. If you just take the example of homeschooling, so very roughly what I would do is every summer I would sit down. Well, I'd have read a whole load of things that I knew roughly what I was trying to do in the long term, and then every summer I would sit down and plan what I wanted to do in the following year, which curriculum, which books, which exactly what we were going to be doing. And then I would break that down into a weekly plan, so I knew how many weeks of the year I was planning to school, and therefore what we had to do each week. And then I had a schedule for the week which said, okay, yes, as I said, I'm a planner, so this is what we're going to be doing each day. And so we would, between 9 and 10 would do one thing and then would switch and would do something else. So I had a plan. So every single day that year, that plan, or that academic year, that I had a plan for what we were going to do, what academic work we were going to do, what stories we were going to be reading together. So I didn't have to keep redoing that every week or even every day. Or what are we going to do today? We knew what we were going to do because I'd sorted it all out in the summer. It was a lot less work like that, and I'm sure we got more done because we always knew what we were doing. The children knew what they were doing. Even if I wasn't well, they knew, not when they were tiny, but after a few years, they were able to kind of get on with most of it by themselves, though I was very involved all the way through.
Yeah.
But I just think that having a plan allowed us to cope with things that didn't go quite right. So if someone was ill, we knew what we needed to do to catch up, or if just something happened, or if we took a day off for some reason, we knew what we had planned to do that day and where we needed to get back to in order to get where we wanted to by the end of the year. So I think we were having a structure, having a plan, just made the whole thing more resilient to problems like sickness or unexpected events.
Because you could easily imagine that is either too difficult to do, or it is stultifying and limits creativity and freedom and so on. But my experience of it was, you can get a huge amount done between 8 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon if you break the day up into hour-long chunks with a 5 or 10 minute break, so 50-minute chunks plus 10 minutes, or whatever you do, and just do reading, math, music practice, lunch, personal reading, history lesson. It's like it doesn't matter that what details you have, and different people will put different things in there, but having something. What it reminds me of, reminds me of the book that we bought when Ben was born, the Contented Little Baby book.
Yes.
Was that the one?
Yeah.
So in England, I should explain, and maybe there was the same debates over here. There were these quite heated debates.
I think they're ongoing.
Yeah, I think that my impression is that they are. I'm trying to steer clear of them, but maybe I just jumped in with both feet. There are these quite heated debates between different schools of thought on the subject of how regimented it's good to be with newborn children.
The whole sleep training.
And feeding on demand and this kind of thing. And we just, I remember having a number of conversations with you about it, and we weren't at all trying to be partisan. We had no axe to grind, and we certainly didn't have any investment in one model or another. But I remember thinking, well, what we want to do is we want to get our kids to the point where they are responsive to our family structure and family life, not we to theirs. And the point is, if we don't think that we know better than our 6-month-old or our 10-year-old or our 15-year-old how to order a life, what the heck are we doing? We ought to make the assumption that, on average, we as adults are in a better position to order their lives than they are. So what that means is then you're trying to cultivate at every stage a plan for their day where you're giving shape to it. And then you just project that backwards through the years. So what it looks like for a 6-year-old and what it looks like for a 5-year-old, you go kind of backwards. And pretty soon you run into what do you do with a newborn or a 6-week-old? And of course you're responsive to needs and sicknesses, and they're crying. You don't just leave them crying every single time they cry. But there is maybe this is a subject for another podcast about structure in the life of the youngest kids. Maybe we'll just sow that seed for future reference. But it actually made it much more manageable with our children just doing the upbringing thing to have a plan. And then, like you said, you with the education, that was another area in which you had a plan and then just followed it.
Can I just come in there? You said something about, having a plan, could that be seen as, in homeschooling particularly, as sort of leaving no space for freedom and so on? And I'll say actually it was the opposite, because I knew what we were doing and what we were trying to do. And so if I saw some event coming up, I mean, we lived in London through most of the years of our children's education. There were often things going on in the big museums and in other places. And so I knew that we could take that time off and go and do these really amazing things, because I had a plan and we could come back to it. And the children knew that this was an unusual day, and then the next day we would be coming back and we'd going back to what we were doing before. And so I think it made me comfortable with actually taking those opportunities. Whereas if I hadn't had a plan, I think I'd have been consciously anxious that we needed to.
Yeah,
where are we? How are we doing? What should we be doing? How much should we be doing? But I didn't need to worry, because I knew the big picture.
And to be honest, and this probably goes for the same for managing at home, raising little kids, educating children and young adults, managing a household with teenagers. You can just build in slack time. I mean, you could have, there are some models of Christian education that have 1 day out of 5 or half a day out of 5, which is deliberately left blank for some form of pursuing something that's particularly interesting to you. So if you've got a 7-year-old who just wants to read The Hobbit again, it's like, well, okay. Just go. Or if they're cultivating vegetables in the garden, or they've got a part-time job in their teenage years or something, that's fine. You can build in that. Yeah. But if you build it in to your family life, you're not then thrown for an emotional loop when the months and years tick past and they've been sort of drip feeding these things in, and there's been no underlying structure to give direction to their upbringing. There's a few other areas I want to touch on, and I'm not sure which order to take them in. Maybe there's a cultural piece. There's the element of the cultural pressure towards identifying ourselves as needy. Then there's also a bunch of distinctively feminine female elements like how women respond to stress and hormonal challenges there, and then there are some theological things. Maybe if you take them in that order.
Okay.
So if I set the scene and then you tell me your reaction to this, and,
Okay,
and
go
everyone buckle up, because this could sting a little bit.
Go on.
What I mean, not from me, I mean from you.
Oh.
The rise of critical social justice ideology has led to a cult of the victim. I mean, there's a whole background to this, and I know we've talked about it a fair bit, and I've taught about it a fair bit in various contexts as a pastor and conferences and so on. But basically what's happened is that the oppressor-oppressed narrative from Marxism was kind of filtered through the grid of the Frankfurt School and became a victimizer narrative in other areas of life in relation to gender and sex and social standing and wealth and immigration status and skin color and so on. And in that context, the person who had the highest social and moral standing was the person who could portray themselves most persuasively as a victim. So if you are a victim of, let's say, anti-black oppression, your social standing goes up. Now, there's just enough wisdom and truth in this to do damage. Of course, it's a terrible thing when people are victims of any kind of unjust oppression, racism, sexism, anything else. But within this framework, the only thing that counts is people's oppressed group status, oppressed group membership, and the status that goes with that, even when it's not actual. So you see this in the university contexts where someone who is in the archetypal oppressor groups on all the different domains, this is the contribution of intersectionality, where all these different axes of oppressor-oppressed narrative kind of intersect. So you're white, male, not homosexual, citizen rather than immigrant, wealthy rather than poor. You're the oppressor in all these contexts. You don't get to speak. You don't get to contribute. What you have to say is not regarded as having a moral or epistemic standing. Now, so within that context, what happens to Christians even, but anybody who experiences circumstances which are painful in any way, or just difficult, or just challenging, or new? The answer is there is a social pressure to identify ourselves as victims. And in this case, it's victims of my life circumstances which make it so difficult for me. My husband is just always so busy, and he always so exhausted when he comes home. He never has time for the children. I feel so harassed. I feel depressed. I feel out of control. And the social pressure will, if you find yourself on the knife edge of, am I going to stand up to this strain and push back against it, or am I just going to crumple under it? The social pressure is all to crumple, because we'll have an implicit sense of social validation to the extent that we can point to ourselves as being victims of circumstances beyond our control. So that's the cultural picture we're in. So now just focus on the situation of a young mum, or a newly married wife, or just a young woman who's single, young adult, or not so young adult, making her way in the world. Do you see that cultural pressure towards identifying oneself as a victim and as weak? Does that figure in how women in particular might be tempted to characterize themselves?
Yeah, I think it can do. I think one thing I've observed talking to people is often looking back on childhood, there'll be a characterization of what are perhaps normal ups and downs of childhood and normal issues with parents who are not sinlessly perfect, or siblings who are not always delightful, and people or ladies I've found sometimes can paint their childhoods as exceedingly bleak, and sometimes I find myself wondering whether they weren't just normally kind of regular bleak, just ups and downs of normal regular life in a fallen world. So I think there can be a bit of that. I also think there can be a tendency among women sometimes to think that being emotionally fragile is somehow feminine and beautiful. And being...
Where do you think that comes from?
I'm not sure. I don't think it comes from the Bible.
No, it's hard to see Jael and Deborah and Hannah and...
No, or Lydia or Proverbs 31 wife or any of them.
Yeah, Ruth, the shrinking violet. Naomi, emotionally fragile, but under immense pressure, and then wonderfully redeemed by the end of the book.
And she's not really the heroine of the book.
No, she's not. She's redeemed by a woman who has got a real spine.
And who actually does have many of the problems that Naomi doesn't have as well.
Right.
So I'm not quite sure where it comes from, but I think it might come from looking at a caricature or looking at a way of thinking about biblical masculinity, which is strong, and therefore, well, if we're going to be biblically feminine, I must be the opposite. So therefore, I need to be fragile. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I do wonder sometimes whether, that's the way we think, and we don't look to the role models of Scripture or to the role models of history, which we alluded to earlier, where women have been tremendously emotionally strong in a very feminine way.
I mean, it's interesting because the weakness point in 1 Peter 3, Peter speaks to the husbands in a way that is very explicitly encouraging them to have regard for their wives as the weaker vessel, to live with them katagnosis, according to knowledge, in a way which takes account of their emotional and whatever he means by weaker. I'll come to that in a second. And so it wouldn't be inconsistent with biblical teaching to say that there are circumstances in which it's expected that a man ought to take the brunt of the physical or emotional strain directed at a family. But that's completely different from saying that a woman therefore ought to cultivate a spirit of weakness.
Yeah.
And that maybe that's... I think so often that our pastoral theology goes wrong, especially in these areas where there's a lot of cultural chatter about these issues. People are trying to figure out on the fly what masculinity and femininity look like, and they're making a mess of it. And we're all kind of in danger of being reactive to the latest fads and trends. This is the kind of thing that can result where people wrongly infer from the fact that a man should have regard to his wife as the weaker vessel, that the wife ought to cultivate that kind of weakness so as to give him space to flourish. It's like, that's...
Yes.
Yeah. When we talked about this earlier, we both noted that the term trauma being used to characterize those, especially those early experiences, but actually we've both heard the word trauma used to describe experiences in adult life as well. And I've whenever I hear people say what you just said, when you talked about the danger of mischaracterizing things in that way, I'm always conscious that there are people whose experiences were genuinely appalling.
Yeah.
Abusive, negligent, that suffered violence of various kinds. My goal is not to belittle those experiences, but in fact I'd say it's quite the contrary. And the problem with the characterization of everything as trauma is that belittles those experiences.
Yeah, absolutely.
In other words, some people genuinely are treated appallingly and have very, very painful childhoods and neglected, they're treated with violence, they suffer sexual abuse or whatever else, and that's trauma. And then there is a spectrum along which most of humanity is scattered, of parents who are more or less well-meaning, doing a more or less perfect or imperfect job, or who are more or less absent. And if we extend the label trauma to anything that is not perfect, then we're actually belittling the experience of those who really do suffer. But it's worse than that, because what happens is that we start to believe the labels we apply to ourselves. We make ourselves weak by the description that we apply to ourselves.
And also perhaps by continually dwelling on the things that have been harder in our lives. We've all had hard things in our lives in various ways. And if we're continually dwelling on those things, I think it makes us weaker, because we're not getting over that and moving on to the next thing, but letting that kind of memory kind of cripple us into the future.
Yeah, I mean, you alluded, this is a helpful transition to another thing I wanted to talk about, the biblical background to all this. We talked a good deal before your recent teaching to the ladies at All Saints on the subject of biblical femininity.
No, that's coming up in September. It was emotions.
Sorry, emotions, pardon me. But in that case, we really were ahead of the game, weren't we? Because we were talking about I can't remember how you framed the question, but it was something like, where in the Bible do you go to find a portrait of biblical femininity? And my response was, well, everywhere. That is to say, it's not that there's a chapter about the perfect woman. I mean, Proverbs 31 is what
close,
people think, but even that is, to some degree, a synthesis of and an abstraction from other ideal woman narratives in particular. It draws on biblical themes that are found elsewhere. And in none of those cases, do you find that the cultivation of a lack of emotional capacity to deal with the normal hardships of life, or even the extraordinary hardships of life, is ever portrayed as a virtue. Even among, if you think of someone like Hannah, she's, just imagine being the favoured but barren wife of a man who's quite insensitive. Am I not more to you than 10 sons? It's like a grip, Elkanah. And also horribly mistreated by Peninnah. And so she goes, and she's, tearful and clearly emotionally distraught, to the point where, Eli's reaction is, well, what are you doing drunk in the sanctuary? And she says, I'm not drunk, I'm pouring my heart out to the Lord. She doesn't cultivate self-pity. Even there, where you have somebody who must have felt very alone, let's face it. I mean, she must have felt like, it's just me. She turns to the Lord and she finds him. And so I guess my thought is, just returning to this issue of how we encourage people to characterize or not characterize their experiences. I do want to encourage people not to debase the currency of trauma. We end up with a kind of debased pastoral vocabulary where everything that's painful is traumatic. It's not traumatic. I know that some people's experiences are far more painful than mine. But in a sense, my concern is not to try and figure out where you sit on the scale of having experienced pain and trauma. That's the mindset that's fed by the critical social justice ideologues for whom it matters where you sit on the scale of the oppressed and the oppressor. From our point of view, we ought to be saying, look, there is a right and Christ-like way to respond to all the different circumstances of life, most of which, let's face it, are less painful than many of our brothers and sisters in Christ have experienced in the past. And it's never feeling sorry for yourself.
That's another reason to read good Christian biographies.
Good Christian biographies. Distinctive feminine challenges, hormonal ups and downs, monthly cycles, puberty, teenage daughters. Just fix that problem for us, will you?
In 30 seconds, off we go. I think puberty is a hard path, I think, for pretty much everyone to go through. And for girls, there are lots of changes that go on, and physical and emotional. And I think as a parent, or as a mother particularly, you want to kind of hold your daughter's hand through it, but at the same time teach them to be able to cope with their own emotional up and downs themselves by not endlessly talking about their emotions or how they feel about everything, but just to be able to say, yeah, sometimes we feel pretty down about things, and I do too, and we pray about it and we move on. Another thing that I have encouraged lots of women to do is to track their cycles, and so that if you're feeling down or tearful or everything seems overwhelming, you can kind of check the dates and think, oh, okay, that's why I'm feeling so overwhelmed. And so it's me, it's not my circumstances. And I'm going to pray and take a deep breath, and in a couple of days things are going to be better. And in the meantime, I'm going to get on with the things I need to do, knowing that I'm feeling more wobbly about it, but I'm just going to get on and do it anyway. It's not a reason to stop or to seek counsel. It's just that time in the month.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because there's two ways of responding to that, isn't there? There's the way of saying, this frustrating circumstance, the washing machine is broken and I'm feeling hormonally emotional. So this frustration is a crisis because I'm emotional. Or there's the way of saying, no, I'm deluded by my hormonal
It's a very strong word, but yes.
circumstances into thinking this is a crisis. It's not a crisis. I only think it's a crisis because I'm emotional.
Yeah.
Deluded is a strong word, but our emotions are an extremely bad guide to moral conduct.
And of course, if you're pregnant, the whole thing multiplies, or if you've just had a new baby, your emotions are all over the place. If you're feeling, I think I said this at the emotions brunch, if the week after your first baby's born, you suddenly realise that your husband doesn't love you anymore, it's probably your hormones, not his love for you.
Yeah. Well, and just returning to 1 Peter 3 and speaking perhaps more directly to the guys, and much of this would be talking about women and the particular challenges of being a wife or a mother or a woman. Just speaking particularly to the guys, a large part of what Peter has to say about living with our wives according to knowledge has got to do with that distinct biological difference, right? If we can't notice when our wives are hormonally emotional, like, shame on us, really, guys. We should be paying attention, and it's not the time to spring some carelessly articulated and needless dramatic change of plan that's likely to make life feel very uncertain. Whatever it is, there's a time and a place, and then there's also just the simple reality of going the extra mile to show kind of care and compassion for our wives. But it does work both ways, isn't it? It is quite hard to work out what to do with somebody who just wants to feel sorry for themselves. Whereas, again, maybe this is a sense in which the being a helper goes back the other way. It's a wonderful situation to be in as a husband, to know that your wife is saying, I'm feeling emotional, and I know I'm prone to overreact or be tearful in response to things. And I've got to say, this has never really been you, but, people's biology is different, right? It's a great position to be in, to be a husband whose wife is saying, I know I'm a bit emotional. I was yesterday. I'm feeling a bit emotional today. I know this is just that time of the month. Give me a hug and hold my hand. I don't blame you, really. I know you love me. I'm just feeling a bit up and down at the moment. And then a husband can actually be a support. And I think it can draw couples closer together because you've got that sense of, we're on the same side. You don't want to have a emotional tailspin. I don't want you to.
No.
We're just helping each other to handle these normal ups and downs of life, rather than it cultivating the excuse for emotional self-indulgence. And that is a strong way of putting it, but it's worth calling a spade sometimes, I think.
And it is where our culture is at the
Right,
moment.
right. Again, so back to the cultural discussion earlier, isn't it? It's, anxiety and the sovereignty of God. Let's end with this. I know you've got to get off and to the next thing, but
It sounds like a title of a book.
anxiety and the sovereignty. Yeah, I don't know. Somebody should write that. John Piper probably already has. But if anxiety is the certainly at times ungodly response to the anticipation of painful future circumstances, the sovereignty of God has something to say about that. And that, now, from a theological point of view, there's a lot we could say about how God's control over all our circumstances should be articulated theologically. But perhaps, can you just say, just as we conclude, what would you want to say on the basis of, or off the back of God's in control, to women who at times do feel anxious, fragile, lacking in resilience, and they genuinely want to grow. They don't want to be blown and tossed by every wind of everything else, much less their emotions. They know God's in control. Can you connect the dots, or just speak to them for a moment or two, just to say something that might be helpful to them?
Yeah, so I guess when we're feeling anxious, there is that element of, we don't know the future, and it can be tied in with a not trusting God's control over the future for us, and not trusting his promises. I guess I'd always want to tread very carefully, because I wouldn't want to impute kind of ungodliness to somebody who is genuinely concerned and worried about something. But I think one of the things that I would probably try and encourage someone to do is to articulate what they're actually concerned might happen, and then sort of looking at Proverbs 31, that the wife depicted there can laugh at the years to come. And that's because she's put things in place that actually, going back to resilience, it's actually made her and her household kind of resilient or robust against the things. So when the snow comes, they have is it
Scarlet.
Yeah,
She's not worried about snow for her household. That all the kids are dressed in scarlet.
Yeah, and she has the clothes prepared. She has the food prepared. She's got the plan. She's done the work, and so she can laugh at the years to come, even though she doesn't know what they hold, because she has kind of got things under control at this point, and she is kind of practically resilient, and therefore probably more emotionally resilient to what's to come. And then knowing that the Lord has his hand on everything.
It's intriguing to me just to reflect theologically on that for a moment, that your response to God's sovereignty in these circumstances is not let go and let God. It's you find a way of connecting God's sovereignty to our circumstances via our responsibility to make the most of every opportunity and laugh at the years to come, which are in God's hand. So I think that's intriguing, because I think often we fall into one of those two ditches. It's either frantic activity as though the world and everything in it depends upon me, or abject despair, or resignation and inactivity and a kind of passivity. But it's, that the Proverbs 31 lady trusts in the sovereign Lord just as much as anybody else, if not more, even while she's preparing for the days to come so she can laugh at them. Yeah. I need to let you go.
Great.
Thanks for joining us. And maybe we should do this again sometime. for those of you who've been watching right to the end, I hope you found it as illuminating as I always do listening to my wife talk. And the Lord bless you, and bye for now.